Today I'm coming from my garage, the north side of my garage. I don't know if you can see it here, and why am I coming from here? Well, today we're going to be talking about some of the earliest land plants, and the earliest land plants we think actually lived in very moist areas. And then being on the north side of the garage, this is a place where the sun really never hits. These are where actually most of these plants that we're going to talk about today are actually living, and we'll show you a few examples here. Before we get into those plants, I wanted to quickly review a few things about plants from the other day. I have 4 questions here, and you may want to hit pause here before we go over them. Think about them. First one, number 1, what are some of the characteristics of plants? Well, remember, plants are all eukaryotes. They all contain chlorophyll A and B. They all have cell walls made of cellulose, and they're mostly photosynthetic. What are the basic needs of plants? Plants all need water, sunlight, minerals. Number 3, what phrase is used to describe the life cycle of plants? This is referred to as an alternation of generations. Alternation means to go back and forth, and it goes back and forth 2 generations between 2 generations rather, called the gametophyte and the sporophyte. We're going to look at a few examples of those here today. Number 4, compare the gametophyte and sporophyte stages. Which stage is haploid and which stage is diploid? Well, if you remember, the gametophyte is the one that makes the gametes. Gametes are haploid, like sperm and eggs. So this is the haploid generation. The sporophyte makes the spores. This is the diploid stage of the plant life cycle, okay? Okay, plant diversity. Today we're going to talk about the earliest groups of plants. Where do you suppose early plants lived and why? Well, you might think that, like most life began in the water. Why in the water? Well, water was the easiest place to live. There was no need to get water because you're in it. Your nutrients are brought to you by the water itself. And as far as supporting yourself, the water supports you. So you don't have to fight gravity as much as living on land, and some of the challenges it promoted. The first land plants, in order to move up onto land, we figured that plants had to evolve certain structures. They had to be resistant to drying, they had to find some ways of conserving water, and they had to be able to reproduce without, and the blank here is water. Here is a very early land plant. We see structures that you might recognized as resembling stems and root-like structures, and up at the tips here are reproductive structures. As a matter of fact, here's an early fossil of a plant like that. Let me move this outside here for a sec. This one was called Cooksonia. This is in rock. But this one evolved from some kind of water-dwelling plant itself, okay? We're going to talk more about Cooksonia and its relatives tomorrow, but today is mostly what we call the non-vascular plants. Vascular tissue is tissue that allows them to carry water. And these plants we're going to talk about today really do not have that. Here's our cladogram that we looked at earlier. Our plant ancestor down here on the left, remember the left is the past, bottom left, and the upper right is the present. So bottom left we see some kind of plant ancestor, some kind of algae. And this very first group of plants is the green algae. And algae, at one time not considered plants, today are considered plants. And here you actually see some of this right on my garage, on the siding here. That green stuff behind me is algae. Okay, it can live there because this is the north side of the house and it's moist. Okay, as a matter of fact, I gotta wash it off this summer sometime. But then we see the next derived character is embryos. Embryos are small little plants, okay? In other words, they have specialized structures. And this first group that we're going to look at today is the bryophytes, or in other words, the mosses and their relatives. And we're going to look at some of the structures they have, okay? So let's start with green algae. Green algae, as you know, are mostly aquatic. They live in moist areas, like my siding here on my north side of my house. However, most of the time they're in water. Most of them are unicellular, like the one on the behind me on the siding is unicellular. Some are colonial, meaning they can live with others. I'll show you one in a moment here. And some are multicellular, but even though they're multicellular, they lack cell specialization. In other words, you don't see stems and roots and flowers in these algae. Here are some of those different multicellular ones. Here's one of my favorites called Spirogyra. It's a long filamentous algae, about the thickness of your hair, and it has a chloroplast, and that's kind of a spiral shape like the spiral in your notebook binder. Over on the right here is one called Volvox. This is a colonial algae. As a matter of fact, all these little tiny green dots, which you can barely see here, are single cells. And then they form this hollow ball of cells that you can see with the naked eye. It looks like a big green, I guess a smaller green bubble. You might see them floating on tops of lakes in summertime. This is a colonial algae, and they each have little flagella here, and they can all beat together and sort of make this whole thing swim real slowly through the water. A very cool one to see under the microscope. Okay. An algae life cycle has an alternation of generations, just like all plants do. Okay. So over here on the right, we see the asexual stage. Okay, let's start with, here's one algae cell with a couple flagella. It can divide by mitosis and make copies of itself and form, in this case, several what are called zoospores. This is the asexual phase, and since this is a haploid part, this is the part of the gametophyte. Well, over here too, we see the gametophyte going to make gametes, and that's how it gets the name gametophyte. It makes gametes. Okay, here we're going to call them positive and negative. Since they're no different, we can't really call them male and female, but in other organisms, we would say one is a male, one's a female. They will get together and fertilize one another and combine to form this zygote. Okay, and this zygote here is the beginning of the sporophyte generation. Here's our only diploid phase of the algae life cycle. This one cell here called the zygospore. This is the sporophyte. This one will divide by meiosis to produce zoospores, which are the beginning of the next gametophyte. Okay, so again, gametophyte over here, that's all this haploid part, and then sporophyte is this diploid phase right here. Okay, very little time spent in the sporophyte stage in this particular type of cell. Okay, now bryophytes are the next group of plants I want to talk about here today. They are small plants. They require standing water for reproduction. So if we look on the ground here, down, let's position the camera right here. This is the siding of my house, and here are some mosses. Okay, position that. They do have to live very low to the ground where it's moist. And they require this because sperm has to actually swim from one plant to another, and they'll do this on the ground. Okay. The other reason they need to stay small and close to the ground like this is that they don't have what's called vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is like plumbing. Whoops. Back here. Vascular tissue. It's wrong here. Going the wrong way. Vascular tissue is like plumbing tissue. Sorry, folks. I'm scrolling the wrong way here. Okay. There we go. Vascular tissue is like plumbing tissue, and they don't have it. So the only way they can move water is by moving it through their body through osmosis, like basically how a sponge carries water throughout itself. So they have to stay close to the ground. You'll never see an algae more than a couple inches in height. Okay, there's three major groups of the bryophytes, the mosses being the most common one. Here is an example of a moss. Okay. Liverwort is another one. I do have some of those growing here as well. They kind of get their name because they look like sort of liver-like shaped. And then there are the hornworts, and those I don't have an example of right here. Okay, mosses and other bryophytes have a couple of major body parts. Got a little dirt on my computer there. They have down here at the bottom the gametophyte, and that's the green leafy structure that you see. That's mostly what you're looking at when you look at a cluster of these mosses. Under the ground here, they have a special part called rhizoids. Remember that for the test next week. It's a root-like structure. We can't call it a true root because it doesn't have vascular tissue, but it does the same job. It holds it in place and absorbs water. Okay, this leaf-like and stem-like structure do most of the photosynthesis. This is the gametophyte here, okay? So all of this and the rhizoid, okay, which means they're all, you guessed it, haploid. Okay, the sporophyte is the part that grows on top. Here you can see these little sporophytes sticking up here. Okay, the sporophyte consists of a stalk here and a capsule. Inside the capsule is where the spores are formed. Okay, these are a little early here. They're not going to have spores yet. A lot of times you'll be able to kind of tap on this, and the video I'll show you later on or give you the link to will show you how that spores come out of there. Spores are single cell reproductive structures. Okay. So the body parts again include the gametophyte, that's the dominant stage, the haploid part. Now there are two different sexes in the bryophytes. Unlike algae, which because they were the same, we just call them positive and negative, no male, no female. Here we have male and female parts. The male part is called the antheridia, and I always remember that because I think of like a deer antler, okay? Deer antlers are found on the male deer, and it kind of sounds like anther to me. So that's the part that produces the sperm. The sperm will then swim over to the egg, which is called, well, the female part is called the archegonia, okay? Think of Joan of Arc from history. She's a female. She produces the egg. So basically, she stays in one place. The sperm swims over to her on that water, which they require, and that will produce the fertilized egg, which produces the zygote, which is the beginning of the sporophyte generation. The sporophyte then consists of the stalk and the capsule. And again, like all sporophytes, this is the diploid part that will produce the spores. Here is that life cycle, okay? Let's start with one of those capsules up here. Much like a salt shaker opens up and produces lots of little pieces of salt. This one will eventually mature, and these little spores, single-celled structures, will blow out in the wind, get carried to maybe a favorable place to live, and they will start growing into what's called a protonema, which basically looks like little green fibrous structures. Those cells will divide by mitosis. They'll have separate sexes. They'll have male ones called the antheridia and female ones called the archegonia. Okay, at the tip of the male antheridia are sperm, which will swim over to the female part. The sperm will swim down into the archegonia, and down here it'll find an egg, and once it fertilizes the egg, we have the beginning of now the blue stage, which is the diploid sporophyte. So here's that sporophyte stage beginning. That egg will then divide by mitosis to produce this sporophyte, which is going to grow into the stalk here, and eventually the tip of it will form the capsule, and inside the capsule, certain cells will divide by meiosis and begin they'll produce spores, which will then begin the haploid gametophyte generation all over again. So just like all plants, we have this gametophyte alternating with the sporophyte. Unlike with the algae now, we're seeing a trend of a larger and increased importance of the sporophyte, okay? Still, the main part of the life cycle of the moss is the gametophyte, all right? That's what we call the dominant stage. Okay, human uses for mosses and bryophytes include soil additives. I have a bag of this over here. I'll show you. This is something we use when we garden. It's called peat moss or sphagnum moss, and stuff looks like this, and we can add that to soil in the garden or containers of plants and things like that, and it helps loosen up the soil. Some people in countries, especially like Scandinavian countries, will burn it like fuel. I'll burn it like firewood. And we call that peat. Native Americans used it for diapers because it absorbs water so well. And if you're ever in the woods, sphagnum moss will serve as handy washcloths. It's really clean and moist, and you can kind of wash your hands off with it if you got some dirt or something on there. So the bryophytes do have some economic importance. And throughout geologic history, we find that this fuel will eventually form coal. Not in our lifetime, but over thousands, maybe millions of years. Coal is formed from peat. So obviously we use a lot of coal in society nowadays. So again, today's plants were all about the early plants. They had to all live in moist areas like this garage and like the ground below the north side of my garage here. If I go to the south side of my garage, I won't find any of these because it's too sunny, too bright, too hot, too dry. Now, I did put a video clip in called Mosses and Bryophytes Life Cycle. I put a separate link in. You can't click on this through this site here, but take a look at it. It's about, I think, 10 minutes or so in length, and add to your notes as you view it. So